and I'd like to welcome you guys to our webinar on the Main Street Disaster and Resilience Toolkit. My name is Bethany Rogers. I am Vice President of Strategic Growth at Main Street America, and I'm joined today by our colleague Marta Olmos, who is our communications whiz, and she's been a big support with our disaster toolkit work throughout the program, and also Manuel Ochoa. And Manuel, when I hand it over to you, if you want to give a little more of a background, but Manuel's been part of the Main Street America movement from back when Main Street was actually housed at the Trust, and he was a collaborator on this toolkit and a co-author. And Manuel, if you could, Manuel's our tech guy, and we're going to get the room warmed up by a few questions just to understand where all of you are in your disaster planning process and to get a sense of why you decided to join us for this webinar today. So we're going to use Mentimeter as a tool, and it's going to involve using your phone and the QR code. So I hope you have your cell phone close by. And to get started for our icebreaker here, what you'll do is you'll just hold your phone up to the QR code there, click on to Mentimeter, and then you should see a version of this question just like this on the phone once you get through the site. And you can start answering the first question, which is, we're curious how many of you have completed a disaster plan? Yes, no, or kind of so.
And one more way that you can join is you can go to menti.com and then use the code 16561651. That will take you to the icebreaker. You can also do that on your phone. It'll look a little bit differently, but that will work as well. So let me go ahead and share our Mentimeter.
We're still seeing the PowerPoint, not the website.
There we go.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So Sarah said actually on Mentimeter, yeah, so as you get queued for all your questions, you can go ahead and ask. So if it asked about one of our other warm-up questions is, have you recently experienced a disaster and how long ago? So all those answers will still come in live here to Mentimeter when Manuel pulls it up here for us. So just ask the questions as they show up. You can tell you have two X-Gen folks navigating the technology here. So Manuel, the first question though, that sounds like that folks were seeing was actually how recently a disaster has happened. So they're getting queued for the three that we were hoping to be the icebreaker were this one. So they're starting to come in. We've got one yes. And a decent number of folks who've at least maybe implemented some strategies or been part of a larger disaster planning process, which is actually a better number, Manuel, than we saw with a lot of our workshops.
That's right.
When we were doing these as part of the research to build out the toolkit, this is a better level of preparation than we were seeing. But still about half haven't really gotten started, and two rocking out. Was that Kimmy from The Office? Was that her name, the character? She was always a good one.
And then let's see, are we doing the three questions? So we have
yes, the three questions for the icebreaker. The other one was, how recently have you been impacted by a disaster? And then folks have also started with the word cloud.
We have 19 responses. So for that, what does resilient mean to you? Being able to bounce back. Prepared is the word that's the most popular. Other words include sustainability, recovery, thriving, bounce back. You see, we have 22 responses to that. So yeah, prepared, people think about being prepared as being resilient.
Yeah, and bounce back
And bounce
is
back.
coming in a couple different ways.
Strong.
Fluid, that's a real inflexible.
Ready.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'll give it a few more seconds to see if we can get about how many participants. You see, we have about 30 maybe. Numbers gone up.
Mhm.
All right. So yeah, so about ready, prepared, strong seem to be some of the biggest words. Flexible. Great. And then for our third question, we had, has your Main Street been impacted
Wow.
by the disaster in the past 5 years?
So very immediate for the majority of the folks on the call today. Wow.
Very recent.
Mhm. Very interesting. Okay, great. If you're seeing more questions, hold off. Those are meant to be the wind down questions, I guess.
But
The
if you've
warm
already
down
answered it,
questions for the webinar.
okay, yeah.
But great. And this is helpful for us to understand where you guys are coming from as far as your experience, both with disasters as well as the disaster planning process. And then Manuel, if you could, what we'll do is go ahead and now get into the webinar content and pull up our slideshow. And I'll get started with some background on the toolkit and the work we did that was funded by the National Park Service. Thanks, Manuel. So we have, and I think, Manuel, did we skip over the one slide that had all the data about just how affected the rates of impact these days? There we go. This was one of the stats that we quoted in the toolkit, but the level of disaster striking our Main Street communities is not only becoming more frequent, but the damage is also becoming a lot more intense. And so as we started doing research for this toolkit, that will take us to the what we heard. Certainly not only that your Main Street districts are experiencing more disasters, but the impacts to your economies and your districts are becoming more and more severe. And you can go ahead and take it back, Manuel, to what we heard. We also learned that most of you, as our questions reveal, don't have detailed plans and maybe not even really clear roles that your Main Street plays when it comes to helping your downtowns or your districts recover from disasters. We know that you're being asked to play, often in cases, as recovery managers, and that it's really, you understand now that it's imperative to you to better understand what it means to build more resilient buildings and districts. And we also know, because so many of you work in districts that have either historic assets, like built out assets, or they're really, your communities really serve as cultural, social ties and networks to your communities. And there's a lot at risk of being lost. And that's actually was the entry point for this work getting funded by the National Park Service. They certainly support what Main Street is about at a full level, but as keepers of the National Register of Historic Places and their imperative to really protect historic and cultural assets in the country, they were interested in how they could work with us to better understand how some of our historic assets are threatened due to natural disasters in Main Street districts, but also how we can help empower you guys to be able to help restore those assets or prepare them so that they don't experience as much damage in the event of any kind of natural disaster. So next slide. So this was funded specifically through the Emergency Historic Preservation Fund. These monies that were allocated in the late 2010s because of Typhoon U2, Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, Florence, and Michael. that mostly hit the southeastern United States. Next slide. And so the work for this was twofold. One was a series of workshops. We did trainings in Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and California, as well as some national workshops. And we offered trainings, but we also used the workshops as a time to understand what kinds of disasters our main streets were experiencing, what kind of strategies you were implementing, what kind of support needs you had, and what strategies were really working for you. We developed this toolkit. It actually took 3 tries to create a format that we thought would really serve you as the primary audience for this toolkit. In part, we just wanted to better understand what are your needs now as main streets, as natural disasters are becoming more frequent. We also wanted to be able to provide you with up-to-date resources and strategies in a really accessible format that spoke to the Main Street approach that all of you use in your regular Main Street work. And so there's a lot of focus in the toolkit, of course, on small business support, historic resources, and strategies around communications and events. And we really wanted to lift up what's really working in the network. We're trying to learn better, at Main Street America and with our partners, what it means to be really good at disaster recovery and to build more resilient communities. So the case studies and what we call the Main Street moments were a big part of this toolkit. Next slide. So a lot of the toolkit, does focus on our main streets. Initially, the work was focused more in the Southeast United States because of the funding dollars, but the National Park Service was really encouraging for us to look for examples of communities outside of the disaster areas of the funding to just be able to lift up the work of other main streets throughout the network. And these are only some of the many that we touch on in the toolkit. Next slide. And last, I did want to talk about, we really understand that a lot of our network is at risk. We used the CGEST. It's an EPA designation looking at what makes a community climate vulnerable. And so that means a combination of having limited economic resources and also being at high risk for certain disasters like agricultural loss, extreme flooding. And the majority of our network really falls within those kinds of designations. So we have a real commitment to understand that disasters do disproportionately harm low income and communities of color, and we are really earnest in trying to understand how we can support them so that they can minimize loss, but also try to help restore their communities the way that they want to on their own terms. And I think from here, Manuel, you will take it over. Yep, this is the part on the content.
Thank you, Bethany, and good to be with you all this afternoon. We're really excited to share the toolkit with you. It's been out for a couple of months, but we wanted to give you a good overview so that you can get to know the toolkit, some highlights, how to use it. As Bethany said, it was very important for us that the toolkit was designed in such a way that you could come at it from no matter where you were. So whether you experienced a disaster recently, whether you're trying to prepare for a disaster, plan for one, or recovering from one, we wanted the toolkit to respond to that. We also wanted the toolkit to respond to whether you were a small business or whether you were an elected official that perhaps you wanted to share this with, or Main Street manager, or maybe from another kind of place-based management organization. So we really wanted to respond to all these different needs, but one of the things that really was a rationale for this is that there really wasn't anything out there that responded to the needs of Main Street or Main Street-like organizations. So we wanted, again, just real easy about how it's designed. The toolkit is around, plan, the first part, prepare, respond, and recover. And just by way of background, so since Bethany mentioned, I've been affiliated with the Main Street America for many years, and I was glad and honored to be asked to come back and help out with this toolkit. I've worked in, my background is in urban planning, housing, and community development, and worked on disaster preparedness and especially disaster recovery at the Department of Housing and Urban Development after Hurricane Katrina, which really brought it home on the effects, and Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, among others. And 3 years was really, I think, really was a good amount of time. We're really thankful that the Park Service gave us the time and space to really explore and think about what was going to be in the toolkit and to learn from all of you. So as far as like what's in the toolkit, as you can see here, we really wanted to have some communication tips, some ideas and best practices, some easy to use tips that you'll see. We have call out boxes called pro tips that are really easy to use, implementable, that very much speak to our Main Street way of thinking, and then training resources, whether it's worksheets or actual links to slide decks, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. It's all in here for you. So as far as planning, really one of the things, we know that it can seem very daunting. And so where do you even start? So the best place to start is to just really understanding what is your local risk, looking at what are your available resources. And of course, speaking to our roots in historic preservation, really inventorying the existing resources and just really just having a conversation. I think one of the things that we talked about too is just even having convening a group of small businesses and just asking them similarly a question like, have you prepared? Do you have a disaster preparedness plan? Just kind of get a feel for where they are, or even just walking around your main street and looking at gutters, looking at the condition of sidewalks and stormwater drains. Those kinds of things are good, easy ways to just get the ball rolling and get started. One of the best ways, as I mentioned, is about assessing your risk. FEMA has a national risk index, which you can link to on the website. I feel like I have to say this because I know we've all been checking, as we've heard, there are websites that are no longer functioning at the federal government level, but this one is. So we're glad to hear that. I check it every day before we do a webinar, and it's still there. So and you can look at it from a region, but then you can drill down and look at your county, and it will give you information on a whole bunch of different indices, whether it's your risk for flooding, tornadoes, what also social vulnerability and your ability to bounce back. So they come up with an index. So that's also another good way to just talk about what's the risk in your community. And so that really leads to just understanding what is your baseline. So really, starting out where you are with a simple question of, do you have existing plans locally? How does your Main Street organization connect with those existing plans? Does your county emergency management organization know about your Main Street organization and your impact? So that's one place, so they know that you're a partner. Who else can you partner with, whether it's your local Red Cross? And again, inventorying those historic resources, and then knowing if your community is a certified local government is also a baseline, because then that gives you the options for some state and federal grants. As I've mentioned a few times, the historic and cultural resources, I'll just reiterate that that's one of the lessons that we learned is how many communities had not conducted a resource inventory. And that is very important to do before the storm or the natural disaster, whether it's an earthquake, because after the disaster, even though FEMA is required to look at historic resources, if they don't know what's important in your community and it's been severely damaged, it can be tagged for demolition. So rather than having to just kind of grapple on the fly, and as we heard from a community doing a windshield survey right after a storm, for example, it's better to just have that information up front. One of the other great things that we've been able to include is Main Street America has created a tool that will help you with inventory. It's called the Booms Tracker. And one of the great things about it too is you're able to use it on your handheld device. So this is one way to be able to do an inventory. And it looks at cultural and significant properties, but it also looks at other things related to the condition of the building and just information about just property ownership and other things like that. So this is another excellent tool that easy to use, something that you don't have to recreate. The other thing, as we heard too, that we learned is there were a lot of questions from Main Street communities, depending on where you live, on just on how you talk about it. I mean, we know that there are skeptics out there on climate science, and I think the easiest thing to say about this is, you know, it will really derail the conversation on disaster preparedness and resilience if you argue about the climate science. Even though we know this, there's hard science, you know, backed up by, you know, 20, 30, 40 years, that might not be the place to start. So we really wanted to give you tools that you can use. And we teamed up with Dr. Tiffany Manuel from The Case Made, and she has really helped to think about how you talk about issues in a different way that will resonate with different audiences and different people. Housing is one of those issues, so that's how I got to know Dr. Manuel. And so we asked her to talk about how would you talk about this in your community about downtown preparedness and resilience. And so these are some of the tips that she's made. We have worksheets for you in there, and then just a guide about how to just start the conversation. And one of the things that we highlight here is making the economic case for preparation and how it protects the downtown economy and highlighting the places that people love. The other piece of it too is we talked about the challenge of trying to come up with tools and resources for different audiences is where you're coming at it. So we understand, so the disaster preparedness tool that you might use, or the training for your small business, might not be or would not be the same one as what you would need as a Main Street organization. So if you're a Main Street organization that's interested in doing this for yourself, which I highly recommend that you should, so you know how to prepare, is we have a link with the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofit. They created a prep manual, and that talks about all the different areas that you need to think about in your organization, whether it's finance, human resources, connecting with a community. We also have a really easy to use, the FEMA Open Training Toolkit, and that already has PowerPoint slides. It also has guides and training materials, handouts that you can use. And that's a really easy toolkit to just use if you want something that's approachable for your small businesses and for your organizations. There is also a disaster resistant business toolkit that we found. There is a cost to that, although I think there is a introductory version that is available. And then finally, if your community is ready to talk about what the future looks like, we partnered with the Lincoln Institute on Land Policy, and we have tools and worksheets on using exploratory scenario planning, which, using maps and data that you might have locally, you can partner with the university or your local planning department and think about what might happen in 3 years or 5 years, depending whether you had a hurricane or an earthquake or a fire. How would those scenarios impact your community? And then for prepare, you know, we look at simple strategies on how you can improve your disaster response, how to prepare the built environment, and then thinking ahead about what are some priority projects, and what are some pathways to federal funding. We understand that this is changing. However, there are through the Infrastructure Act, was one of the biggest investments. Those dollars are still out there. Some of those dollars are managed by state government. So really understanding how you fit in and where you might be able to advocate for some large projects. There's still investment dollars that are available. So you might want to look at that based on what you've already thought about in your downtown. We also talk about how to mobilize volunteers, which is an important component of main streets across the country. So, and in terms of building connections, again, I would reiterate just connecting with your local emergency management manager, thinking about organizations that are engaged in mental health and social services. What are your, and also thinking ahead. So if you're thinking about what the impact may be to some of your historic buildings, you might want to have some tradespeople and specialists in your Rolodex, in your virtual Rolodex or your LinkedIn, so that you can reach them after the disaster, because they're going to be in demand after the disaster. So you want to have those relationships before. And then some easy steps that you can take. I talked earlier about walking around your downtown. I talked about clearing and repairing storm drains, tree limbs near utility lines, and then removing any combustible materials. And that's another activity that you can do with your small businesses, and then get outside and talk about what some potential hazards might be in your downtown district. We talked also about identifying needs, and this was something that we had the opportunity to do at several of our regional workshops. So really taking the time to think about what the needs are, and maybe you already have a short list. Maybe there are some things that you hadn't thought about. So that's why meeting with your planning department or your other partners to think about what a resilient downtown looks like is a key to think about ahead of time. So you can map that and then prioritize that, because our wish list is probably much longer than the funding that's available. So helping to prioritize that, and then frankly prioritizing that with the funding that's in the queue. So as we know, the federal funding landscape is rapidly changing. So as those dollars that are available start to wind down, you want to have those conversations with your elected officials and those who understand the federal funding landscape at the state level and the federal level, because you might want to move up some of those projects that you thought maybe they might be funded in 3 to 5 years. You might want to move them up if you think they're already past the early planning stages. I do want to make a word. We talked a lot about resiliency, and one of the values that we learned that's, I think, important on how we look at this is what we heard from communities in many vulnerable communities, is that when you talk about resiliency, be sure that you talk about resilient buildings and resilient communities as a whole, but not make sure that it's not about resilient people. So I think a lot of communities that have that are distressed already, or have been disinvested or underinvested in, feel like they're put upon because they're being, after a disaster, they're being asked to be resilient, and the people are resilient. So it's what we're really talking about is how can we build the community in such a way that the buildings and the infrastructure is resilient, and so they don't feel like they're being talked down to, that they should do better in some way, because they are doing a lot, and they have managed to be resilient. And so that's, I think, something to remember about when we talk about resiliency. That's something that I learned for myself and made me think about it in a different way. The other thing that we learned too is about creating volunteer networks. And certainly many main streets have long years, decades of experience managing volunteers, but you may want to think about this differently in a disaster context. So you given the position that your main street organization may have in your community, it might not be as damaged as other areas One of where I grew up for high school in North Carolina was damaged by flooding in the recent storms that from the tropical storm force rains that hit the winds and the rains, primarily the rain, the flooding rain. The downtown was not damaged. It was the outlying areas that got severely damaged. So in that case, your downtown might be the point that people come to for relief services. They may come to for food, for goods and donations. So you may find yourself in that position. So you want to think about how your network is activated, how you train and engage your volunteers for a disaster scenario, and also how you handle donations of goods and money. One of the things that we learned, and many of you might have heard this already, is that people out of the goodness of their heart want to donate clothing, or they may want to donate goods and services, but then you don't have a place to put it. So you have to think about where you're gonna stockpile that. And then try to encourage donations of money rather than goods, because what happens is that there's a accumulation of goods that need to be stockpiled. And if you're not very specific, you may get the wrong things, and people are donating sweaters in the summertime when what people really need are other things. So that's something to think about in the communication. And then as far looking more long-term in terms of responding and recovery, there is the short term and there's also the long-term strategy. So we really wanted to give you a good understanding about what it looks like when your downtown was just hit by a natural disaster. So really understanding, focusing on the damage, assessing the emergency funding. We talked about historic assets, and also thinking about, starting to think about soon after in the long term about how to build back better. But we really, one of the things that we heard also is that right immediately after a disaster is not the time to start talking about resilient and infrastructure projects, as and that probably just comes naturally given the impact. So that's why you want to do things before the disaster hits. One of the things that we also heard too is, especially in historic buildings, about following preservation standards. So learning what the impact can be on different kinds of building materials. Since we were funded by the National Park Service to do this work, we have lots of great tips and information about how to deal with flooding, how to deal with masonry, how to deal with different kinds of building materials that were damaged. Also understanding how to help your businesses access the FEMA and SBA funding. Those change periodically, so you should try to keep up to date on how that SBA funding may change. One of the good things that was changed in the last administration is that funding is now available for entrepreneurs or people that that don't have a storefront. So that's a good thing, especially for those businesses that are more hybrid and work remotely. Of course, contacting your insurance is extremely important. And I think one of the Main Street superpowers is, of course, supporting small businesses. So really helping them to navigate those small business claims and encouraging them, by the way, to take photos as soon as possible. So probably the reaction that all of us naturally would do is to want to go in and clean up after a disaster, but you should encourage them to take photographs of all the damage as it is and then start the cleanup, because the insurance needs to see what exactly happened. And you may lose some of that information because you no longer have the photographic evidence because you've already started to clean up. We also talked a lot about balancing preservation with recovery. And so there are some tips around preservation standards. There's a whole flooding guide that the National Park Service developed a few years ago. That's very handy. And it gives you tips that you may not have thought of. So, some repairs that you might do to masonry, if you don't do it right in the cleanup process, the damage may be expensive to to reverse. So you want to think about that. And then, of course, the supporting small businesses right after the disaster is, really important. And so what Main Streets already do and turning that into the disaster recovery mode, such as that marketing support, understanding what the pathways to recovery are, and how do you help them adapt? So, for example, is there a space that has not been damaged where maybe businesses can set up shop temporarily while their building is damaged?
Mhm.
And then finally, you also should think about yourselves as Main Street managers, and there are many here that seem that they've experienced their own natural disaster in their community, and so recognizing that it can be very overwhelming and frankly can create burnout. Many Main Street managers have burned out after a major disaster, so really looking out for your own emotional needs, making sure you have that backup, whether it's somebody else in your organization or a partner organization or the city that can help you out, because you do need to take some time, because in many cases, the Main Street manager has also experienced damage. They may have lost their home in a disaster. So don't forget about self-care, and don't forget to enlist and understand the local mental health resources, not just for yourselves, but also your small businesses. And then we talked a bit about what long-term resilience looks like. We have talked about planning for that. So researching all those funding avenues. We understand that some of the information that we have listed may change. We do have links to those federal agency websites. So for now, we don't see any major changes, but probably in the next 12 or 18 months, we may see some changes to long-term resilience investment. But again, just look at what's available, not just from the federal government, but also look at what regional and state partners might provide. We also have a great link to a website, a clearinghouse that Georgetown University hosts, that lists also state and local government resources that support resilient reconstruction. So Bethany, I'm going to kick it back to you to talk about what's next at Main Street America. And
Okay, yeah, I wanted to talk about a couple final themes that overarch the toolkit, and then I'll tell you guys where Main Street is starting to explore some partnership opportunities, both with funders and the network, to bring you guys deeper support around disaster recovery and resilience. But I just want to emphasize that one of the things we were most intentional about is trying to help you understand that you can implement what we've shared with you incrementally, and we really encourage you to start simple. There's anything you can do from a communications plan or supporting your small businesses to develop their own disaster plans or resilience plans, and then to take it up to the organizational level, and then to start thinking about citywide resilience plans. So really, we were very intentional about making this an incremental process for you and to help you find entry points where you could start very simple. We also really want you guys to understand that one of your superpowers is the way that you can center what's special about your community to essentially use any kind of recovery effort. The most impactful stories were when Main Streets were centering either what was a true asset historically or culturally to the community, or if they were really centering social networks. So Main Streets that kept like their first Fridays going post disaster, so everybody could still get back together and connect and share resources and simply just be with their neighbors again, or cases where, as for instance of Marion, Iowa, where they lost a huge part of their tree canopy that was a big part of their community identity, and how they used that theme to restore their trees as a big motivation for restoring their community, and also to really do this work in advance. The more prepared you can be, the better off you'll be to ensure that there's not missteps and miscommunications, and that you can really minimize any kind of unfortunate loss. So to do the work now really pays off in dividends if the unthinkable does happen in your main street. And then as far as what we see coming next, I think these are coming up funny, Manuel. So if you can keep just hitting for me, they'll all no, actually the other way, just keep going forward. I think the animation just got funny on the text. Yeah, keep going because I know there's
Yeah.
probably 5 of them. Yeah, we'll just treat it as static text once you get it there. One more. There's 5 of them. Perfect. So these are some areas where we really expect to start working with you guys and that you'll see more movement for us. The first, this is really like, thanks very much to our incredible government relations team and the partnerships, the deeper partnerships we're building with our state coordinators to build pathways to federal funding, but they're also, we're getting a lot more skilled at Main Street America to support our local main streets to build the right kind of partnerships that they need to be able to access federal funding. Sometimes you have to be part of a regional transportation plan or a regional development plan to be able to get access to major dollars for resilience funding. But this is a space that we're getting a lot more experience in, and we're going to be able to support our network to be able to access those kinds of dollars to implement more visionary and transformative resilience projects. The next thing that we're really looking at Main Street America is what it means to have a Main Street district disaster plan. So just like Manuel said with this toolkit, there's not really a toolkit out there that exists for Main Streets and the particular and special role you play in your communities. But what does it mean to have a plan? So our idea is to build a template that would really resonate with the kind of work that Main Street managers are often looked to do post-disaster. And we really hope to build that out and start circulating that with the network. Another place where we already have a lot of synergy is around small business resilience. With our small business digital trainers and the work that we've done with the network post-COVID, we've been creating a lot of trainings and resources that would really help a business be able to stay in touch with their customers, be able to adapt and pivot quickly, and even do business online if they need to. So we intend to build out a curriculum to really help you support your small independently owned businesses to be resilient in the wake of disasters. We're also exploring helping all of you be able to build either more powerful fundraising strategies or crowdfunding campaigns to be able to deliver emergency funding. We've written about this recently in our blogs, but also in the toolkit where some of our main streets have been able to provide small businesses emergency funding before insurance payouts, unemployment payouts come, and that's super helpful to get your main streets back online. So look for some potential TA we'll be providing in that space. And lastly, taking the toolkit and some of the things we've been learning from our main streets and giving you guides for very main street scale, much more, I would say, sort of bite-sized ways you can help your property owners and business owners implement resiliency projects.